Hello, in this video, we are going to talk about the concept of cell communication. So, we're going to primarily be focusing on how cells communicate in the human body, though cells in other systems also communicate in similar ways, but this primarily kind of focuses on how cells in the human body communicate with each other. And communication is really important for cells. They can talk to each other to let each other know, hey, there's a bad guy around, or hey, we need to grow, we need to stop growing, etc. So there's different things that cells talk to each other about, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So there's different types of signaling, and when a cell talks to another cell, they usually use a chemical signal. And so there's different types of chemical signaling. There's autocrine, where a cell is talking to itself. So just for whatever reason, it needs to tell itself something. A gap junction type of communication is when two cells are right next to each other and they have these proteins called gap junctions that have basically a gap inside that allows them to send messages to each other. Then there's paracrine signaling, where a cell will send a signal to another, and they're usually nearby, but not right next to each other. And then finally, there's endocrine signaling, where a cell is going to talk to a distant cell. Usually, hormones are going to be involved. These are the signaling molecules, and those hormones travel through the bloodstream to reach the target cell. And that could be somewhere else in the body, as long as it, is exposed to the bloodstream or is near the bloodstream. It should be able to receive those hormones and be affected by that signal. So let's talk about the two types of receptors that are involved. So when a cell receives a signal, it uses a receptor, which is a protein. That protein slash receptor binds to the signaling molecule and it basically receives the signal. And so think of it as like your mailbox at home. It's the one that receives your mail. And so these receptors receive the signal. So there are two types of signals. There are lipid-based signals, and they will be able to pass the cell membrane because they're made of lipids. And because they're able to pass through the cell membrane, they're going to go inside of the cell. And so the receptor for these lipid-based signals are going to be intracellular receptors found inside of the cell. So I like to think about it, if, some houses, your mailbox is inside of the fence. So your mailman actually has to, go onto your property, and then maybe your mailbox is right at your door, like a little slit at the door, and your mail is received directly into your house. That is kind of what this is. Your mailman comes in, and then it drops off the mail, at your door. And when this happens in a cell, typically the signal and the receptor together are going to bind. They're going to go into the nucleus. They're going to regulate gene expression. That is one of the most common things that happens in this kind of signaling pathway. Now, the other type of signal is a protein-based signal. So in a protein-based signal, the molecule is made up of protein, so it cannot pass the cell membrane. It's going to be outside of the cell. And so in this case, the receptor that is found is going to be on the surface of the cell. So going back to our analogy with the mailbox, a lot of houses have mailboxes that are right at their fence. And so your mailman does not have to go onto your property to drop off the mail. They can just walk along the sidewalk and then just drop the mail off right there. Or there are even some mailboxes that are closer to the street. The mailman doesn't even have to leave the truck, right? He can just drop off the mail. He'll just drive his truck right up to, your house, and then just drop off the mail right into there. And so that's what a protein-based signal is like. Its receptor is on the surface of the cell, attached to the cell membrane, and so everything that's happening, the interaction is happening basically outside of the cell, or right at the border of the cell. And so one example of this is neurotransmitters. These are molecules that neurons use to communicate to each other. And these neurotransmitters are protein based, and so they'll be released, and then the receptor is right on the surface of the receiving cell. Now let's talk about some specific types of receptors. And one famous type of receptor is called the G protein coupled receptor, or GPCR for short. And this is what they do. So here at the top, we're going to start here at the top of this circle. This is the setup that we have. We have a G protein coupled receptor, which is coupled or associated with something called a G protein. So this whole cluster right here is called the G protein, and this is the G protein coupled receptor. Now, when a signaling molecule binds to the receptor, that triggers the G protein alpha subunit, so the alpha portion of the G protein, to grab a GTP. So it's originally holding a GDP. It's going to get rid of this GDP and pick up a GTP. By the way, GTP is similar to ATP. It's going to have 3 phosphates, and the GDP has 2. Anyway, the GTP binds to the alpha subunit. And then this triggers the alpha subunit and the beta gamma subunits to separate from each other. And basically, they're going to go away and they're going to trigger a cellular response. I'm not going to go over the details of what's happening here, but basically, they trigger another protein, which triggers another protein, and it basically triggers a bunch of things that are happening in the cell, and changes are being made. Now, this whole complex needs to reset. So to reset, what happens is the GTP is converted to GDP, so 1 phosphate is removed, and then the whole complex comes back together like this. So there is a cycle going on. So when it binds to the molecule, all of these events happen, and then, the response is made, and then we go back to normal. And again, this response that's happening is totally dependent on the G proteins that we're talking about and the signaling molecule. So maybe this could trigger an increase in the production of a specific type of protein, or this could trigger cell division. So whatever it is, a response is happening. I'm just not going over the specifics of what that response is. There are dozens of different types of G protein coupled receptors and different types of signaling molecules that go through the same process, but they end up with a different response depending on what they are. All right, the other type of receptor I want to talk about are the tyrosine kinase receptors. Again, there are different types of tyrosine kinase receptors, but they all function the same way. So first of all, the setup, there are always going to be 2 tyrosine kinase receptors that are right next to each other. And when the signaling molecules bind, it causes the tyrosine kinase receptors to dimerize. So they're usually separated, they're near each other, but they're not touching, but they will then dimerize to form this complex. Then the tyrosines that are found on the inside part of these receptors, they're all going to be phosphorylated with ATP. So ATPs are used to phosphorylate, and of course ADP is what we have left, and the ADP goes away. And then these phosphorylated tyrosines activate a bunch of other proteins. And again, we are just using relay proteins as a kind of generic term, but there are a bunch of different proteins that can be activated, and then those activate other proteins, which et cetera, things happen in the cell. Again, we're not going over specifics on what's exactly happening, and that's because there are multiple types of tyrosine kinase receptors that will bind to multiple different types of signaling molecules, and we're going to get different types of responses. But all of them are going to go through this same process, dimerization, phosphorylation, which leads to the response. All right, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.